Welcome to another Intro to Java video. In this video, we're going to bring all the pieces together from object-oriented programming that we've talked about in the previous 4 videos. And I'm going to make a set of classes that are going to draw a couple circles in the frame. Each of those circles are going to have their own sets of controllers. And what we're really going to explore here is how you can get data back and forth between classes, how we use methods to share data in very different places. So let's take a look at the program and run it. It's going to look very similar to the circle program that we saw in the last video. Only difference is there are going to be 2 sets of circles. So the circle can get bigger and smaller. You notice I'm updating this circle, but this circle over here isn't updating. Now this one is blue, green, red, red, blue, smaller, bigger. They both behave independently. Okay? Both of those circle panels come from the same circle class. I'm not going to go over the circle class again because we've already seen it. But the circle class is the exact same one that we looked at just a little while ago. You remember when we updated the default color to pink where it was originally black? Yep, it's the same one. Let's take a look at this circle frame because it's a little bit different. What I've done in this circle frame is I have taken all the controls out of this class and put them in another class. If you run this again, you'll notice that each circle has its own GUI. So this is the GUI for the circle on the left. This is the GUI for the circle on the right. They both have panels that hold the GUI and the circle. Okay, and there is a panel on the top that has the title. So let's look at the code. There's a border layout. It's going to be used to lay out the frame so that there's the top, center, and bottom where things are going to be going. There is a title panel, a circle and control 1, a circle and control 2, and a center container. So circle and control are these 2 panels here that hold the control panel and the circle panel. Okay, and I've got 2 of them. And then both of those are being held in one larger panel called center panel, which is put into the center of the border layout of the frame. So you've got a J panel holding those 2 J panels that hold control panels and circle panels. I have a title called label, and that's going up on top here. I have 2 circles, circle 1, circle 2, and I've got 2 circle controls, control 1 and control 2. So these circles, once again, are the same circle that we saw in the previous video. Got my main, I do all the stuff that I always do in a main. I've got my create GUI, and I'm breaking it down into setup title and setup center. Setup title is nothing special. It's creating a J panel to hold the title, putting the title on the panel, and then putting that panel in the north. Setup center is a little bit bigger. That's where we're going to create our whole, basically that whole GUI, where we're going to have our center container, which is the J panel that holds these 2 panels. I've got circle and control 1 and circle and control 2. What those are is these panels right here that are holding the control panel and the circle. And I've put a border around them. And the border is done using something called setBorder from the JPanel class. And it uses a class called Border Factory. And it's got some static methods in Border Factory that allow us to do some things with that border. So create line border, and I did color black on those. If you want to look more at Border Factory, you can look it up. After that, I set up circles and set up controls, and we'll look at those in just a second. I set the preferred size on my 2 circles. Remember, these J panels that have the circle in them, we can set the preferred size because they are J panels. J panels have that ability. So I set them to 250 by 250. If I made these bigger, those panels would get bigger. If I made them smaller, those panels would get smaller. Now I'm adding the circle and control, I'm adding the circles to circle and control 1, and I'm adding the circle and controller to circle and control 2. And you can see that I'm adding them to the center and south of those 2 separate panels. And then I add those to the main container, and then add that container to the frame. All right, let's take a look at setup circles. Nothing new about this. I'm just instantiating two circles. The instantiation of a circle we saw in the previous video. It takes in the x and y and width and height on those two circles. So we're instantiating two circles. They're both JPanels, and now they're created. So after we instantiate them here, we're able to add them to their respective panels and then add those panels to the frame. Setup controls. This is where things get interesting. This is where I'm going to start talking a little bit more in depth in using objects in other classes. So these are my two control class objects, control 1 and control 2. And remember, the control is this portion right down here. The control class is used to set up the GUI. Well, why did I do this? Why did I take the GUI out of the frame? Well, you have enough experience with making GUIs now that you probably know that it's a lot of work to make a GUI. And just to make 2 buttons and 3 radio buttons, there's a lot of code that goes into it. Each one of these things is 4 to 5 lines of code to make this happen. So every time you add more GUI, it tends to balloon the project. So if I wanted to make 4 more of these circle and controller things, that would be 4 times the amount of code that it would take to do these. So I wanted to have it so that I could very easily make a whole bunch of circles and a whole bunch of controllers and just roll them out into an application if I wanted to, and not have to worry about always retyping out that stuff to make the GUI. Code reuse is the big principle here. I know that I wanted to do this many times, so I'm going to put that into a class and just be able to use that class to create a GUI. Now what I want to get at is the relationship between the controller and the circle. We saw in that previous circle program, the GUI controls had a item state change and action performed. And what they were doing is they were calling some methods from the circle class. The action performed was calling the set size, and the item state change was calling the set color method. And I used those GUI controls in the frame class to update the color and the size in the circle class. Well, given that I don't have those GUI controls here in this class, and I do have the circles here in this class, I need to have those circles next to those GUI components so that they can update it. Remember I talked about that in the previous video. In order for the GUI components to update things in the circle, the instance of circle has to be next to those GUI components and the listeners so that they have access to one another. That's all going to happen in the circle controller. So in order to do that, we have to pass these two circles into their own controllers. So control 1 is going to get circle 1. Control 2 is going to get circle 2. That means this object, this GUI object here, is going to only be controlling circle 1. And this GUI object here is only going to be controlling circle 2. Well, let's go into that circle control class and see how it works. So circle control class constructor, it's a lot of C's, takes a circle into the parameter. Then we pass that up to an instance variable, and that means the circle is now going to be available everywhere within this class. So every time I instantiate a controller like this, I have to pass a circle into it, and whatever circle comes into that controller object is going to be controlling the circle that got passed in. Setup controls, this is just creating that GUI. This is the exact same GUI we saw in the previous video, so I'm not going to go over it in depth. Just know that I'm setting up the controls here. This is going to create the GUI, create all those buttons, put them all on that panel and all to the and set up all of their listeners. Okay, so I've got my controls, I've got my circle. Now, given that this circle is in this controller class, the controller's action performed and item state change now can interact with the circle through the circle's methods. So let's look at that. Action performed. This looks exactly like the action performed from circle 1, except I just tore that out of circle 1 and I put it into circle controller. So given that the circle is inside of this class, I can use set size and repaint in action performed. And given that the circle is in this class, I can use set circle color inside of here and repaint inside of here in item state changed. So this looks exactly like circle 1, except in circle frame 1, everything was combined. Here, I've just got it distributed outward. Okay, so let's tie this all back to stuff that we've been doing since we started doing nested inner classes. When we did these things as nested inner classes, I would have had the circle panel inside the frame. I would have had all the GUI components and controllers inside the frame, and those would all be sitting next to each other so they can directly interact. Now, given that they're distributed out into separate classes, they can't directly interact. So I have to make sure that a circle gets into the circle controller. This is a very important OO concept, is that if you want to have instances of classes or objects interacting with one another, you have to have those objects adjacent to one another. In other words, either the instance of an object has to be in another class, or you have to have two objects sitting side by side so they can pass data back and forth. This is how we move data between classes in object-oriented programming. All right, this should give you enough information to get you ready to do your next assignment. Thanks for watching.